Welcome to Betrayal Affairs. In today's video, the night carried a peculiar stillness, the kind that presses against your skin in ways that feel both familiar and unsettling. Emily stepped out of the house, the heavy wooden door clicking softly behind her, sealing off the last threads of music and laughter from the party she'd just left. Out here, the world felt different. The laughter that had been ringing in her ears only moments ago was gone, replaced by a hush broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves shifting in the faint autumn breeze. The air was sharp and cool, tinged with the earthy smell of damp foliage scattered across the ground. She tightened her coat around her body, not entirely because of the chill, though it clung stubbornly to her skin. It was something else. A hollowness, an ache in her chest that she couldn't name but had been carrying for months now. Mark, her husband, had left hours ago. She replayed the moment in her mind, as if studying it would reveal some clue she'd missed. He had leaned close to her at the party, his breath faint with wine, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I'm heading out. Not feeling well." She had nodded, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture that once might have been tender. But even in that fleeting contact, she could feel the distance. His eyes had already shifted past her, not waiting for her response, searching for the nearest exit. And she hadn't stopped him. That was how it had been between them lately, polite, functional, but stripped of warmth. A marriage that looked intact on the outside, but felt hollow from within. So she had stayed among people she barely cared to see, smiling at the right moments, laughing when the rhythm of the room demanded it. Not because she was truly enjoying herself, but because the alternative, going home to silence, to the heavy air of her marriage, felt even worse. The party itself hadn't been remarkable, not really. What she craved wasn't the event, but the presence of voices, the background hum of life that reminded her she still existed outside the walls of her home. Now, most of the guests had already trickled away. Cars pulled from the driveway one by one, their headlights sweeping brief arcs of light across the wet pavement before disappearing into the night. Emily pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb brushing the cold screen. Black, dead. She remembered how the battery had died earlier, how she'd meant to borrow a charger but never asked. She didn't want to step back inside now just for that. She sighed softly, tucking the useless phone back into her pocket when a voice cut through the stillness. "Need a ride?" Emily turned, startled by the sound. A few feet away, leaning casually with his hands deep in his coat pockets, stood Daniel, Mark's closest friend since college. The porch light cast him in a muted glow, shaping the edges of his tall frame, highlighting the steadiness in his gaze. She knew him, of course. Over the years she'd seen him at gatherings, barbecues, holidays. Their conversations had always been polite, brief, the type reserved for someone who orbited your life because they were tethered to someone else's. "Only if it's not out of your way," Emily replied, her voice light but cautious. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. "It's no trouble." His tone carried warmth, the kind of warmth that made her hesitate for just a second before nodding and following him toward his car. The vehicle smelled faintly of leather, mixed with the clean, understated note of his cologne. Not overpowering, but noticeable. When she fastened her seatbelt, the click echoed louder than it should have in the hushed space. The engine purred to life and they eased onto the road. Streetlights stretched their glow across Daniel's face as they passed, etching shadows that deepened the sharpness of his jawline, the steadiness of his profile. But it wasn't his features that caught her attention. It was his composure, focused, calm, yet softening whenever his eyes flicked briefly in her direction. Emily told herself not to overthink it. It was late, she was tired, and 2 glasses of wine lingered in her veins. She folded her hands in her lap, eyes drifting to the blur of passing houses. "Did you have a good time?" Daniel asked after a moment, breaking the quiet. "It was nice," she said, though the truth was that she'd felt like a ghost at the party, drifting from one conversation to another without truly being present. "Been a while since I've been to something like this," he said. "Back in the day, you used to go to every get-together. At least that's how I remember it." Emily smiled faintly, a shadow of something wistful tugging at her mouth. "That was a long time ago." The light ahead shifted from green to red, and Daniel slowed to a stop. For the briefest of moments, their eyes met. It was nothing more than a glance, but something unspoken rippled between them. She looked away quickly, suddenly aware of the heavy beat of her heart. The car rolled forward again, gliding through neighborhoods lined with quiet houses. Warm light glowed in a few windows, and Emily wondered how many of those homes were filled with laughter and how many held the same silence that haunted hers. "Mark mentioned you've been buried in work lately," Daniel said, his voice casual. Emily gave the simplest answer she could. "Keeps me occupied." She didn't want to open that door, not here, not with him. Daniel didn't push. Yet she felt his attention anyway, not invasive, not demanding, but steady. The kind of attention that made her realize how invisible she'd felt in her own home. The road stretched on. Music hummed faintly from the radio, blending with the soft rumble of the tires. The silence between them wasn't empty. It carried weight, a kind of quiet that made Emily wonder why she had never really spoken with Daniel beyond surface pleasantries. Tonight, the air felt different. When they stopped at another light, Daniel glanced at her again. This time he didn't look away immediately. His gaze was steady, not heavy, but enough to make her feel seen. Actually seen. She shifted in her seat, heat rising to her cheeks. This was Daniel, her husband's closest friend. Someone who had lingered in the background of her life for years. There was nothing unusual about him driving her home, and yet she couldn't ignore how this moment felt unlike anything before. By the time they were halfway to her house, Emily found herself stealing glances at him, catching the shape of his hand steady on the wheel, the curve of his shoulders under his coat. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, that she was only noticing because they were alone, but the truth dug deeper. There was a pull in the space between them, one that hummed without words. Daniel broke the silence, his voice quieter now. "I can tell you're not happy." The words hit her unexpectedly. She turned her head toward him, startled. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady. She laughed softly, a deflection. "That's a big assumption." "It's not," he replied gently. "I've known you long enough to see the difference." Her fingers twisted together in her lap. She should shut this down, steer the conversation somewhere else. But there was something in the softness of his tone that made her feel safe. Safer than she had in a long time. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Complicated doesn't mean you have to go through it alone," he said. His voice wasn't pushy, wasn't insistent. It was careful, as if he knew one wrong word could make her retreat. Emily turned toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She saw the outline of her face, her eyes darker than usual, her lips pressed thin. She'd been holding herself together for so long, she'd forgotten how to unravel. Rain began to mist across the windshield, soft at first, then heavier. The rhythm of it filled the car, a cocoon of sound that made the space between them feel even smaller, more intimate. "You've been different lately," Daniel said softly. "Not in a bad way, just quieter. Like something's weighing on you." Emily didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat tightened. She thought of Mark, of the nights spent in silence, of the distance that had crept into their marriage like ivy climbing a wall. She thought of the early years, how laughter used to fill their home, how one glance between them had once carried 1,000 unspoken words. Those memories felt like another lifetime. Daniel's words pressed gently against her chest, stirring something she had buried. The rain thickened, drumming steadily. Visibility blurred. Daniel guided the car off the road, pulling beneath the small awning of a closed cafe. The engine idled for a moment before he shut it off, leaving only the rain's relentless percussion against the roof. Emily sat still, her breath shallow. The quiet between them was no longer neutral. It was charged, heavy with all the things neither dared to say. "Emily," Daniel said finally, his voice low, hesitant. "I don't want to cross a line here." Her pulse quickened. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Every part of her waited for what he would say next. He tapped his fingers once against the wheel, exhaled slowly. "But I can't pretend I haven't noticed you, more than I should." Her chest constricted. She should tell him to stop. Should draw the boundary, remind him, and herself, of the lines that could not be crossed. But the words refused to come. Daniel's gaze met hers, steady, searching. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause, the rain, the night, her own heartbeat. Finally, he leaned back, his voice quieter. "You're worth more than the way you've been made to feel." The words sank into her like stones in water, rippling through her in ways she couldn't control. The rain softened, tapering to a drizzle. Daniel started the engine again, easing them back onto the slick road. Neither spoke. The silence was thick with everything that had almost been said. When he pulled into her driveway, Emily felt her throat tighten. The familiar sight of her house, the porch light glowing, felt strange now, like she was stepping back into a life that no longer fit. Daniel killed the engine. "I'll walk you to the door," he said softly. They moved slowly up the path, their footsteps muffled by damp earth. At the door, Emily hesitated, her keys trembling slightly in her hand. She didn't want to go inside, not yet. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel gave a faint smile. "You don't need to thank me." And then, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to something barely audible, a whisper that carried more weight than any shout could. "Emily, there's something you don't know about Mark. And I think you deserve to hear it. But not tonight." Her breath caught. She stared at him, heart pounding, 1,000 questions clawing at her throat. But before she could speak, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Emily." And with that, he turned, leaving her frozen in the doorway, the keys clutched tight in her trembling hand, the world she thought she knew suddenly tilting beneath her feet.